In the late 1960s, Nigeria faced one of the darkest and most painful moments in its history. What began as political tension slowly turned into a devastating civil war that would divide the nation, destroy cities, displace millions of people, and leave emotional scars that remain visible even today. This was the Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War, a conflict that lasted from 1967 to 1970, and a war that changed Nigeria forever. Welcome to Kingdoms and Secrets, where every kingdom has a secret. To understand how the war began, we must first go back to the years before independence. Nigeria became independent from Britain in 1960. At the time, the country was made up of many ethnic groups, cultures, and political interests. The three largest groups were the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the west, and the Igbo in the east. Although independence brought hope, tensions quickly began to grow between political leaders from different regions. There were disagreements over power, elections, resources, and control of the new nation. Corruption accusations increased, political violence spread, and trust between regions slowly weakened. By 1966, Nigeria had entered a dangerous political crisis. In January of that year, a group of young military officers carried out Nigeria's first military coup. Several top political leaders were killed. Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was overthrown. The coup shocked the entire country. Although the coup leaders claimed they wanted to end corruption and political instability, many people believed the coup favored one ethnic group over others. Tension rapidly increased across Nigeria. Soon after the coup, Major General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi became Nigeria's military head of state. But his government faced growing opposition. Many northern officers believed the political balance of the country had been destroyed, and only a few months later, another violent coup took place. This time, Ironsi was killed. Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon emerged as Nigeria's new leader. But by then, ethnic violence had already spread across parts of the country. In many northern cities, thousands of Igbo civilians were attacked and killed. During violent riots and massacres, fear spread rapidly across eastern Nigeria. Many families fled back to the eastern region for safety. The country stood on the edge of collapse. As violence continued to spread across Nigeria, leaders in the eastern region began demanding greater protection and political independence. Many people in the east no longer trusted the federal government. Entire communities had suffered losses. Families mourned loved ones, and anger continued to grow. In an attempt to prevent the country from falling apart, political leaders met in Aburi, Ghana, in early 1967. The meeting brought together Nigerian military leaders, including Yakubu Gowon and Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, the military governor of the eastern region. For a moment, there was hope that peace could still be achieved. The leaders discussed regional autonomy, military control, and the future of Nigeria. But when they returned home, disagreements over the implementation of the Aburi Accord quickly emerged. Trust collapsed once again. Tension between the federal government and the eastern region became worse than ever. Then, on May 30th, 1967, Ojukwu made a historic announcement. The eastern region would separate from Nigeria and become an independent nation known as the Republic of Biafra. The declaration shocked the world. Crowds celebrated in some parts of the east, believing independence would protect their people from further violence. But the Nigerian federal government rejected the declaration immediately. To the federal government, Nigeria had to remain united. Negotiations failed, and soon war began. In July 1967, Nigerian federal troops moved into Biafran territory. The Nigerian Civil War had officially started. What many believed would be a short conflict quickly became a long and devastating war. Cities were bombed. Roads and bridges were destroyed. Thousands of civilians fled their homes, searching for safety. Both sides fought fiercely for territory and control. At the beginning of the war, Biafran forces made rapid advances into parts of the Midwest region. The offensive surprised the federal government and created panic in several areas. But federal troops soon reorganized and launched major counterattacks. One after another, important towns and cities fell under federal control. As the fighting intensified, international attention began focusing on Nigeria. Some countries supported the federal government. Others sympathized with Biafra. The conflict slowly became more than just a Nigerian crisis. It became an international humanitarian concern. Meanwhile, ordinary civilians suffered the most. Food shortages began spreading across Biafra as federal blockades limited supplies entering the region. Hospitals struggled to treat the wounded. Refugee camps became overcrowded, and thousands of families lived in constant fear as the war continued. As the war entered its second year, the humanitarian crisis inside Biafra became increasingly severe. Federal blockades limited the movement of food, medicine, fuel, and essential supplies into the region. Across many towns and villages, hunger spread rapidly. Families struggled to survive. Children became the most vulnerable victims of the conflict. Images of starving civilians soon began appearing in newspapers and television, broadcasts around the world. For many international observers, the suffering in Biafra became one of the most heartbreaking humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. Aid organizations attempted to deliver food and medical assistance into the region. Relief flights operated under dangerous conditions, often landing at night to avoid attacks. Doctors, volunteers, and humanitarian workers worked tirelessly to treat civilians suffering from malnutrition and disease. But conditions continued to worsen. Meanwhile, the fighting between federal and Biafran forces intensified. Major battles took place across several regions as both sides struggled for military advantage. The federal government possessed larger military resources and greater international recognition. Countries such as Britain and the Soviet Union provided support to the Nigerian federal side. Biafra, however, relied heavily on limited foreign sympathy, local resistance, and improvised military strategies. Despite difficult conditions, Biafran forces continued resisting federal advances for many months. The war transformed everyday life across Nigeria. Schools closed in some areas. Businesses collapsed. Thousands of families became displaced. Fear and uncertainty spread throughout the country. In Biafra, many civilians lived under constant air raids and military attacks. Underground shelters became common in some communities. Parents struggled to protect their children while searching for food and safety. At the same time, propaganda and information campaigns increased on both sides. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, and public speeches were used to influence both local and international opinion. The war was no longer only being fought on the battlefield. It was also being fought through information, diplomacy, and global attention. As months turned into years, exhaustion spread among civilians and soldiers alike. Entire communities had been destroyed. Thousands of lives had been lost, and hopes for a peaceful solution became increasingly difficult. Yet despite the suffering, many people still believed the conflict would eventually shape the future of Nigeria forever. By late 1969, the situation inside Biafra had become extremely difficult. Federal forces continued advancing into remaining Biafran territories. Major towns and strategic locations gradually fell under federal control. At the same time, food shortages became even more severe. Many civilians faced hunger, illness, and displacement on a massive scale. The humanitarian crisis shocked people around the world. International journalists, humanitarian workers, and foreign observers reported scenes of suffering that drew global attention to the conflict. Despite the growing pressure, Biafran leaders continued attempting to resist. But military resources were running low. Supplies were limited, and the region had become increasingly isolated. As the war approached its final stage, many civilians desperately hoped for peace. Then, in January 1970, the conflict finally came to an end. Biafran leadership announced its surrender to the Nigerian federal government. After nearly 3 years of war, the fighting stopped. Nigeria remained united. General Yakubu Gowon declared that there was no victor and no vanquished, emphasizing the need for national reconciliation and rebuilding. The government promised policies aimed at restoring peace and reintegrating former Biafran territories into the country. But although the war had officially ended, its impact remained deeply emotional for millions of Nigerians. Families had lost loved ones. Communities had been destroyed, and many survivors carried painful memories for decades. The Nigerian Civil War became one of the most significant events in modern African history. It shaped Nigeria's politics, military structure, economy, and national identity for generations. The conflict also changed global conversations about humanitarian aid and international responses to civilian suffering during war. For many historians, the Biafran War remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of political division, ethnic tension, and failed leadership. At the same time, it also revealed the resilience of ordinary, people who struggled to survive under extraordinary conditions. Even today, discussions about the war continue across Nigeria and beyond. Books, documentaries, interviews, and historical research continue exploring the causes, events, and long-term effects of the conflict. More than 50 years later, the memory of the Nigerian Civil War still remains, deeply connected to conversations about unity, identity, justice, and reconciliation in Nigeria. History remembers it not only as a military conflict, but as a national tragedy that changed millions of lives forever. Subscribe to Kingdoms and Secrets because every kingdom has a secret.